Hospital Porter's Pride and Dignity. Stop the New World Order. Welcome to Panwo TV. Now, several people have asked me about the ASSAP Seriously Suspicious conference that took place on Saturday the 26th of November of this year. They want to know, was it filmed? And I know a few people turned up there and they really enjoyed it. It went really well. It turns out actually there was no official footage filmed of it. I did my talk on Helen Duncan and the witchcraft trial. So I'm actually going to do a little studio version of the talk I gave on that day at that conference. There are several differences between there are several differences between this version of my talk on Helen Duncan and ones that I've done before. The first and most obvious is this one is much shorter. The reason it's much shorter is because I only got 1 hour on stage, so I basically had to give them the Reader's Digest version. But it contains new information, some updates that was not present in the previous versions of this talk, even in the longer one. And the third difference is that my tone is very different. Because I was addressing an audience partly of skeptics, I am deliberately ambiguous about my own views on spiritualism. The reason for this was I wanted to focus on the conspiracy angle, the legal conspiracy against Helen Duncan, rather on the discussion of whether spiritualism is true or not. Now, those of you who watch regularly will know that my own opinion of Helen Duncan and spiritualism is that Helen Duncan was a real spiritualist medium. She was the real thing. I'm convinced of that. But for the purposes of this particular talk, it doesn't matter whether or not Helen was real or not. The point was that people in government thought she was, and they did something. They actually took action to prevent her, to lock her up in jail when she'd done nothing wrong, based on that information. It was a really, really good event, and I want to thank everyone who made it happen and everyone who attended. And here, for you who didn't go, here's your chance to see a facsimile of what I said that day in studio form. I hope you enjoy it. Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Ben, and I'm a conspiracy theorist. There, I said it. Yes, that's right, I'm a loony, kook, tinfoil hat wearer, whatever you choose to call me, although I don't have my tinfoil hat on in this room, because I don't think I need it. No, I'm okay. Well, that being said, I mean, I'm a conspiracy theorist, but I mean, I don't believe every single conspiracy theory, okay. The Earth is not flat. I do not think that the moon is hollow. Lewis Hamilton is not Barack Obama's son. Someone did suggest that once. But I am open-minded, shall we say, to the idea of conspiracy theories, and this website here is where I write about it and film about it and do radio shows about it. I'm also very, very interested in the paranormal, and that is why I think the subject I'm going to talk about this afternoon combines those two things in almost equal measure. It's almost a perfect blend of the two, which I think is one of the reasons I'm so fascinated by it. This is me, the portering Buddha. At least that's what I used to look like. I was a hospital porter, and I was sacked from my job. I was discharged from the NHS under very suspicious circumstances. The reason I was sacked was, I think, guess what? Yes, indeed, it was a conspiracy. It was a conspiracy against me. Now, another reason I think I'm so interested in this subject is because what was done to me was a great injustice, and what was done to the subject of this discussion was a great injustice as well. And I don't like injustice. It's one of my pet hates, shall we say. And my own experience was surprisingly similar in many ways. I don't have time to go into details about my own experience, but I have discussed this elsewhere on my website. It's amazing the parallels, actually, between the experience of this person and the experiences of me. The subject I'm going to talk about this afternoon happened a long time ago. In fact, it happened 72 years ago. But I think it's still relevant. It's certainly still open. There's still research going on into it. And I think its implications affect our lives to this very day and beyond. Now, the central figure of the story I'm going to tell you this evening is this woman here. Now, this is Helen Duncan. This is a lady who was born in 1898 in Callander, which is in Perthshire, Scotland. And she's quite a remarkable person. I think she's one of the most remarkable people in the 20th century history. And if you look into her eyes, it's amazing, isn't it? Her gaze is incredible. They say the eyes are the windows on the soul. Well, these are big windows, and there's a lot inside them. Um, This is a photograph of her taken in her youth. I'll be showing you several photographs of Helen Duncan, and this is my favourite. It's the expression on her face. It's the glint in, it's the glinting look in her eyes. It's the depth of her gaze, which I find so fascinating. Helen Duncan was a medium, a psychic, clairvoyant, whatever. Now, we've all heard of psychic mediums. I mean, we know if you go to a spiritualist church, you'll probably see someone who will stand there and say, "Is there anyone here called John?" And I'm not dissing that at all, but this is the clairvoyance. This is the person who just passes on messages from the spirit world. This of course will depend on your opinions and your beliefs about spiritualism. Some of you may think that what mediums are doing is genuine, and they are genuinely contacting the spirits of the dead. Other people may consider this simply trickery. It's simply conjuring, clever illusion. But whatever your opinion, this is what Helen Duncan did. This was her profession. She did it her whole life, and she was part of an elite group of mediums called physical manifestation mediums. Now, physical mediums are mediums who do more than just pass on messages. They can change, they can alter the world around them physically. By creating noises such as this. That's called a rap. Okay, or things like that. Also, they can make objects move and things like that. Now, Helen Duncan was really at the creme de la creme of this particular elite group of psychic mediums, because she was a manifestation medium. By manifestation medium, I mean that she could actually create physical forms in thin air that resemble spirits. In other words, she could make ghosts herself out of thin air. And the way she did this was by exuding ectoplasm. This is a substance which is said to issue from the medium's body, which witnesses describe as looking like a milky semi-fluid substance. It has a pungent smell, but it forms into shapes. It forms into shapes, and these shapes eventually look like people who have died. And you can actually interact with these people as you would when they were living beings. And Helen Duncan was one of these people, and she was one of only. I was talking to a friend of mine, a fellow researcher, and he said there's only 6 people in the world who can do that at the moment, and I don't know how many there were in Helen's time, but it is very, very rare people who can do this sort of thing. And Helen was the most powerful at the time, and still, no one has matched her power since she died. Now, if you Google Helen Duncan's name, sooner or later you will come across these pictures. Now, these are photographs taken by Harvey Metcalf in 1928, and they are pictures, as you see from the caption, that appear to show Helen Duncan in trance. You're actually seeing Helen Duncan here in a trance, as she is in a seance, and she's exuding ectoplasm, and this ectoplasm is forming into the shapes of spirits, which you can see here on these 2 examples. However, you only have to take a look at these very, very briefly to see that these are dummies. This is fake. These are not real spirits. You can even see exactly how it's been done. In fact, I'd say the faces appear to be moulded from, I'd say, papier-mâché and painted, and the bodies are created by a white sheet draped over them, and the shoulders are coat hangers. You can see quite clearly the coat hanger on the left is one of those art-shaped coat hangers, which you put t-shirts and jumpers on and things, and the one on the right is one of those long straight coat hangers with little bits sticking up at the end, used for strap dresses and things like that. So it is pretty obvious this is not Helen Duncan in trance. And if you get, many people will tell you that they'll point to these photographs and say, look, this is proof that Helen Duncan is a fraud. She's fake. Look, here she is, faking stuff, faking her effects. However, I've been in touch with a gentleman I know in Australia who's been researching this, and there's another side to this story, because the story of these photos being fake, which is repeated in some books, incidentally. Of course, it happened a long time ago, in 1928, and he's discovered these photographs were actually taken by Harvey Metcalf for an Australian magazine, and they're fake. Yes, these are dummies, but it's not meant to be a picture of Helen in trance. It's a reconstruction that was made with Helen's cooperation. She may even have made these dummies herself quite openly, which to indicate to the magazine readers what Helen Duncan being in trance would look like. That's what it is. It's not meant to be real. It's never. No one's pretending that it's real. That's the point. And so obviously, if this other data is real, then that changes the way we should look at Helen Duncan, and that's very important. It's a very, very important point. This is probably more likely to be what you would see, or close to what you would see at one of Helen Duncan's seances. As you can see, this is not actually Helen Duncan, this is somebody else, but this swathe of white opaque material in the air, I think this is actually a ghost. I don't think this person's producing ectoplasm, but this is closer to the reality is what we would see. There are photos of Helen Duncan in trance, which I talk about, which are supposedly photos of Helen in trance, which I talk about in the longer version of this lecture. I must say this lecture is a shorter version and condensed version of a much longer one that I've done, which is over 2 hours long, which you will also see on YouTube. So this is what you would see, and I'm now going to play you a brief piece of audio, which was actually recorded by Alan Crossley, who was one of Helen's biographers, and it's a recording of Helen in trance interacting with the sitters in the seance.
Next person to come here, I want someone just like you, but further back towards the corner there, to ask a young lady out that passed to our side of life. Now, I have a feeling that she's had an operation of some kind.
Is there something wrong?
Will you try her on?
Come on, there.
No, she doesn't move on your voice.
No.
Yeah, I know a young lady.
Yes. Do you know her name?
The young lady sits with her, it's the name of Kathleen.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's right. Will you call her out, please?
Well, come along, Kathleen. Oh. Have you any message for Charlie?
Yes.
Have you?
But I'm all right, but I'm all right.
You are? Oh, that's lovely, Kathleen. Absolutely. I didn't expect to see you, but it's just lovely. Is there anything else I can tell Billy?
That's all.
Now I should say a few words about the seance procedure and how Helen Duncan operated, and you'd be surprised to find out that she actually operated very, very differently to any other psychic medium of her time. She was some of the things she did was standard, but she carried out a few extra practices which others did not, and these practices centered around her need to be believed, her pride, I think, her professional pride in being transparent, so people would understand she was not faking anything. Now, what would happen is the seance would take place in a spiritualist church, in a hired hall at a community centre, or in someone's house that had been just converted for the purpose. A seance room would have a row of seats. There would be lots of seats for the spectators, or the sitters as they were called. And the stage would consist of a curtained-off cubicle called the cabinet, and in the cabinet would be a chair where the psychic medium would sit. Now, what would happen is the sitters would come in, they'd pay at the door. It was 12 shillings, a lot of money, but they would come in, they'd sit down. Helen Duncan would be in another room getting ready, and what she would do is she would strip naked, and a nurse whom she employed would examine her to make sure she wasn't hiding any props or other means of fakery on her body. And this nurse would basically use her hands to search every nook and cranny that she has. And think about that. You know what I'm talking about here. And now you may say, well, that's not exactly foolproof, is it? Because well, this is an employee of hers. How do you know this is not hardly an impartial observer? Yes, but there were impartial observers, because Helen would then invite female members of the audience to come into the room and watch this being done. So Helen would strip down completely naked in front of complete strangers, and this nurse would poke and prod her from head to toe, and these people would watch, these strangers would watch. So Helen assured them that she was for real and there was no hidden props on her body. Helen would then be dressed in a black gown, which would be a long gown, went down to her ankles. She'd be tied into it. It wouldn't have any zips or buttons. It would be tied with string, and she would be basically sealed inside this black gown. She would then put on a pair of slippers, walk into the seance room, and the seance would begin. The lights would be dimmed. Now, this This will, again, this will depend on your opinions of spiritualism. If you see it as nothing but trickery, then it's very simple. The lights were dimmed so that the scams, the psychic, the ghost trumpets and all the strings and other things could be moved around without anyone seeing it. It helped the illusion. However, according to proponents of spiritualism, the darkness actually that was necessary because bright light would harm the medium and would not allow the ectoplasm to form. There was a small amount of light from a dim red bulb, less than 40 watts, that was placed on a shelf a short distance from the cabinet. And then the seance would begin. And this is what Helen did. She did this from... she went... I don't know if she ever travelled abroad, but she was world famous. She spent her life going up and travelling around the country, going to various events where she would perform this. She would perform this seance, this mediumship that she did. And she did several events all over the country. Now, in 1939, World War II broke out, and once World War II broke out, her business boomed. Her services were very much required. Because this was because of the fear and uncertainty in people's lives. We look back at World War II as a historical event, and we know how it went. It's almost like a story. We know how it began, we knew how it ended. To be in the middle of it and not know how it's going to end was very, very different. People were frightened. They expected Hitler to land at Dover at any minute. Especially in the early part of the war, when we had the Blitz, we had Dunkirk. At the end of the war, 300,000 British troops were killed, 60,000 dead in the Blitz. It was a very, very difficult time for many people. There was rationing and things like that. So Helen was very much in demand. And she did several seances up and down the country. Now, one day, on the 25th of May 1941, she was doing a seance at a spiritualist church in Edinburgh. And one of her spirits guides came forward. Helen Duncan had several spirits that came through regularly that were not necessarily a part of one of the relatives of the sitters, but they were her spirit guides, and they acted almost like a master of ceremonies during the seance. They would introduce the other spirits, and they would always appear first. One of these was a tall man called Albert, who came from Australia. When he'd last been alive in his last physical incarnation, he lived in Australia during the late part of the 19th century, and had died just after 1900. Another was Peggy, a small young girl, aged about 5. Albert came forward at this seance in Edinburgh, and he said, "I'm very sorry to have to tell you, a British battleship has just been sunk. I have 1,400 of her officers and men with me now, newly arrived in the spirit world." The audience gasped. "What do you mean a British battleship has just been sunk? We hadn't heard about this. What battleship?" Fatefully, one of the people in the audience was a man called Brigadier Roy Firebrace. He was head of Army Intelligence for Scotland, and he was also very interested in the spiritualism, the paranormal, the occult. He was a member of the Society for Psychical Research. He was keen on tarot, astrology, things like that. And so he was aghast. I mean, as soon as the seance was over, he went to his office and he got on the secure encrypted phone to Whitehall, and he called the Admiralty and he said, "What's going on? I've just heard a British battleship has been sunk. What's going on?" The man at the other end of the phone said, "Oh no, sir, nothing of the sort." And so he hung up the phone and thought, "Well, good, it's just another loony." There are fake ones, of course, even though I believe in them. Anyway, the next day he got a call back from the same person. "I'm sorry, sir, but things weren't quite accurate there. A British battleship has been sunk. HMS Hood has just gone down off Scapa Flow." And Firebrace asked this person what time this happened, and he said it happened the previous day, and the time it was just before Helen's seance. And guess how many sailors drowned when that ship went down? 1,400. 1,400 sailors went down with the ship. Firebrace couldn't believe it. For a man in his position and with his beliefs, he understood exactly the implications of what was happening here. Helen Duncan was getting news of the war outside the usual channel through the testimony of the dead. This must have been an enormous concern for him, because he realised what had happened. He realised that she just reported on this loss of this battleship. This battleship, the HMS Hood, it was called. She was an Admiral class battlecruiser, one of the biggest and most powerful ships that the Royal Navy possessed, and she'd been sunk in the North Sea by Prince Eugen, which was a German battleship. And her loss was a major blow to the war effort. and this is a major surface combatant, this ship. And Helen knew about this dark disaster before anyone else did. And Firebrace knew very well that it's only a matter of time before maybe she starts giving away classified information that's not only unknown but ends up being restricted. And well, you've probably read books or seen movies about spies and espionage, and you know the old cliche, don't you? We had to kill him because he knew too much. Well, what do you do when you can't silence someone even by killing them? This must have been a real conundrum for him. And I mean, this is a picture of HMS Hood going down, by the way. It's taken from another nearby ship. He must have been very worried. In fact, we know he was worried because his daughter, who's still alive today, has a letter in her possession which her father wrote to the Admiralty, and it was copied to the intelligence services, specifically recommending to the War Office and all the government that something be done about Helen Duncan, that she should be monitored very closely, because he knew very well that if our side was watching her, you could be damn sure the enemy was. And so this is what happened. This is how it began. Helen Duncan was watched very closely. Now, well, we don't know specifically if the government actually endorsed what Brigadier Firebrace said. We know that he recommended it, but did the government endorse it? We don't know. But Helen Duncan was a few months later, in November 1941. Helen Duncan was at the Master Temple in Portsmouth. Now, the Master Temple, despite its grandiose name, is actually just a converted room above a chemist shop. And in fact, later on I'll show you some video that I made. I actually went there and filmed. But it's a little room above a chemist shop that's converted into a spiritualist centre. And she was doing her seance as usual, and Albert came forward again and he said, "I'm sorry to have to tell you, but another British battleship has been sunk. I have 850 of her officers and men newly arrived with me in the spirit world." Now, this was a bit of a more sticky situation, because in this occasion the ship that sank was HMS Barham. HMS Barham was sunk in the Mediterranean by a German U-boat, and because of the situation, morale was so low on the home front following Dunkirk and the Blitz and all the other things I've said, that the government decided they wouldn't batter people's spirits any further. They would keep the sinking of HMS Barham a secret. Even some of the relatives of the deceased were not informed. Some of them were sent secret letters and asked not to speak about it outside their family. It is remotely possible that Helen got wind of this through the usual channels, through hot reading, so to speak. But considering the posters they had up in those days, careless talk costs lives, etc., it's highly unlikely. And it's pretty obvious. I think by then she was being watched. MI5 was keeping an eye on her. In fact, I think I know the unit that was keeping an eye on her, because the research by Robert Hartley in his book The Helen Duncan Mystery Show Trial, I think I know which unit was watching her, and I know the individuals, the personnel, at least two of the personnel who were monitoring her. So this was a very, very difficult situation for Helen. But it's hard to say exactly what was going on in hushed voices in the cabinet war room. But she was allowed to go on practicing. No action was taken against her, and in fact it was over 3 years later that something was finally done about her. Now this is what happened. It's in January of 1941. She was arrested. She was performing at the Master Temple again in Portsmouth, and there was a police raid, and she was arrested. And she was expecting probably a slap on the wrist. Another Section 4 of the Vagrancy Act was usually used to deal with fraudulent mediums. She was expecting maybe a 10-shilling fine at worst, and in the magistrate's court for a day, and then she'd be let free with just a small fine. However, this time her accusers drove the case. They escalated it to a level which must have astonished her, and to a level she could barely comprehend. Helen Duncan was taken to the Old Bailey, the Central Criminal Court of London, and charged under the Witchcraft Act of 1735. Now, the Witchcraft Act of 1735 is an archaic law. The only reason it was still on the statute books is because Parliament couldn't be bothered to get enough MPs together to repeal it. It had hardly been used during the 20th century at all, but it was essentially one of the first skeptic laws because it emerged from the British Enlightenment after the superstitious age, the millennium of the Middle Ages. Superstitious millennium of the Middle Ages. And it basically was one of the first laws that suggested that perhaps supernatural powers were not real and witches were actually defrauding people through clever trickery. And the government brought this in because for the purposes of whereby ignorant persons are frequently deluded and defrauded, be it further enacted by the authority aforesaid, that if any person shall, from and after the said 24th day of June, in this year of our Lord 1735, pretend to exercise or use any kind of witchcraft, sorcery, enchantment, or conjuration, or undertake to tell fortunes, or pretend from his or her skill or knowledge in any occult or crafty science. So that was the wording of the Witchcraft Act. So that's what they were going to do. Now, blimey, what the hell was going on? This is unbelievable stuff. It really was for poor Helen. This is a photograph of Helen. It's a newspaper shot taken of her walking to the court, and there's her husband's walking beside her, and you can see on her face the confusion, the worry, the oh my god, what's going on kind of look on her face. You can just see it very clearly, can't you? This was like nothing she'd experienced before, like nothing she expected. And I'm sure loads of questions were going through her head, probably similar to the ones that are going through your head right now. Why her? Why was this being done? And well, that's a good question, and we will explore that in this talk. The witchcraft trial took place in this room. This is court number 4 at the Old Bailey, in the Central Criminal Court of London, court number 4. Helen sat on the bench in the foreground there, that's the dock, where the accused always sits. She had several prison warders flanking her, because she was actually kept as a remand prisoner. She was not granted bail. She probably had, I don't know, she was a danger to society. She had a dummy, and she had a papier-mâché dummy, and she was not afraid to use it. So at great expense to the state, they decided to keep her in jail for most of the time. She was let out just beforehand, but they kept her in jail as a remand prisoner for most of the time leading up to the trial. On the left you see the jury benches, and that's where the jury sat, and on the right you can just see the public gallery. The judges are opposite on those chairs facing her, the judge and his assistants, and in the little pit at the bottom is where the barristers conducted the case. Now again, your perception of what happened here will depend on your opinion of spiritualism. Now on one level it's an open and shut case. She was caught red-handed in faking, defrauding people, taking money off people under false pretenses, and she was prosecuted under a law that was legal. It had not been repealed, and she got banged to rights. She was found guilty, and she was given the maximum sentence. She deserved it too. I mean, Chief Constable Arthur West was one of the prosecution witnesses, and he gave her a character assessment during the sentencing hearing, and he called her a pest on society, a heartless exploiter of grief-stricken and vulnerable people. Well, with her assessment like that, the judge had no choice but to impose on her the maximum sentence, 9 months in jail, which she got, which she richly deserved. Did she not? Maybe there's something else going on here. I mean, the official story was, what happened was, there was a raid on the Master Temple in Portsmouth in the middle of the Seance. What happened was there were 2 moles in the audience. A guy called Lieutenant Stanley Worth and someone called PC Rupert Cross were in the audience. These were basically police informants, and one was a special constable in plain clothes who'd been sent in there to spy on Helen Duncan. And at the exact moment they stood up, Worth switched the torch on and shone it to illuminate the room. The men reached forward and grabbed this bed sheet that was covering Helen, this fake ectoplasm, and the police, they blew whistles. They blew whistles. The police were waiting outside the house, outside the chemist shop, just waiting for the signal from Worth and Cross. They knew what was going on. It was all coordinated. And the moment they heard that whistle, they burst in, up the stairs to the Master Temple above the chemist shop. They switched the lights on. They detained everyone. They arrested Helen Duncan. And it's all pretty clear, isn't it? Pretty clear. Well, is it? I think we should first of all look at the personnel involved in the witchcraft trial. First of all, for the prosecution, the Crown chose a man called it was John Cyril Maud, KC. He was one of the country's top barristers, and he was the kind of guy you want. He's pretty skilled. You want the best man to do which was such an important trial, because as I'll demonstrate, I think this was, as Robert Hartley says, a show trial. Now, John Cyril Maud, KC, had an elite background. He was educated at Eton College, the famous boarding school. Then he's read law at Christ Church College, Oxford. And he was a member of one of these slippery and furtive Inns of Court, one of these quasi-Masonic institutions that all barristers have to join. He was very, very high up in there. He was a member of the Inner Temple or something there. It's strange, though. You'd think the government would actually choose someone who could dedicate themselves full-time to the case of putting Helen Duncan away. When in fact Maud couldn't do that, because Maud was already busy. He was conducting another case at the very same time in court number 1 at the Old Bailey. And in fact he kept nipping between the two courtrooms. And in his absence, his assistant Henry Elam, who was a junior barrister, had to conduct the case in which he would have done otherwise. Funny enough, the job that Maud was doing in court number 1 was he was defending a man accused of murder in Portsmouth, and the chief prosecution witness was Chief Constable Arthur West, that name again, and the man accused West of framing him, and Maud managed to get the man acquitted. So this may call into question the honesty of Chief Constable Arthur West, I think. But anyway, then he was nipping back to court number 4 to conduct his case against Helen Duncan personally, and Elam was allowed to sit down. I think the real reason the government chose John Cyril Maud, KC, was because he had 2 jobs, like many people in the war did, and when he wasn't in court, he was the head of Section B19 at MI5. Section B19 was a wartime unit, which was only there for the duration of the hostilities. But its purpose was human intelligence. Its job was primarily tracking down the sources of rumours and things like that. It is exactly the kind of unit that, if MI5 did want to keep an eye on Helen Duncan, that they would deploy to do so. And Maud being head of that meant that he very well might have been coordinating the monitoring operation of Helen Duncan. So in a sense he was spying on her all through the last few years, and then when she went to court he simply switched hats in order to put her in jail. So we had this strange connection. Is that a coincidence? Is it a coincidence? Now the judge is interesting. The judge is a guy called Sir Gerald Dodson. He's the Recorder of London, who's the Chief Justice. She's the Chief Judge at the Central Criminal Court, and so he's the top guy. They put the top judge in charge of this case. He's a former Royal Navy officer, very, very closely involved in Royal Navy charities. And we have a letter from the Department of Public Prosecutions in existence, today called the Crown Prosecution Service, that specifically recommended Dodson to provide over the trial of Helen Duncan. Now, Robert Hartley has said something very interesting in his book. As I said, this is an open case. Research is still going on. Hartley's book was written in 2007. He believes he's discovered the linchpin, the Mr. Fix-It, the central figure of this, what is looking to me like a cabal. The prosecution side in this trial is starting to look like a kind of cabal. Who's controlling everything? Well, Hartley thinks it's a man called Commander Ian Fleming. Commander Ian Fleming was head of he was a deputy head of the Naval Intelligence Division. So he was head of Naval Intelligence. He was Brigadier Roy Firebrace's opposite number in the Royal Navy. He knew Firebrace, incidentally. Fleming was one of the top intelligence officers in the country. He'd spied on the Moscow show trials, hence the title of the book, Show Trials. This is another show trial, I believe. He'd also spied on the Spanish Civil War, and he was very interested in the paranormal. He was a member of the Society for Psychical Research. He knew Firebrace, and they were both involved in various spiritual and occult matters, paranormal investigation, etc. He knew Aleister Crowley, the famous occultist, Beast 666. Oh yeah, he was the perfect person to not only to have been in the position to organise a monitoring operation, but to have understood the implications of what Helen Duncan was doing. He believed she was real, and he took her seriously. Does the name Ian Fleming sound familiar to you? Yes, he's also the author of the James Bond novels, which of course spawned a very successful film franchise that continues to this day. In fact, in one of the James Bond films, do you remember, it has a sort of occult theme. It's called Live and Let Die. And Bond, who's played by, I think is it Sean Connery in that film, he's the Bond girl, the woman who's the partner of the bad guy, which Bond seduces, which is a common theme in those films. She's into tarot. She reads tarot cards, and there's the theme of voodoo. There's this like voodoo guy who prances around the place. So it's Fleming knew stuff. He really did. Now, the defense counsel was a man called Charles Loseby. Now, he was a spiritualist activist. He was keen on spiritualism, and he often was brought out to defend people who had been spiritualists who were attacked by the government, who were harassed by the government. He really wanted to win this case for Helen. He believed very strongly in defending Helen Duncan. He volunteered. He says, I want to defend that woman in court. And he passionately wanted to. He passionately was behind her. And as a result, I think he made some fatal mistakes, which I will talk about. I will talk about in a little while. Now, this case was essentially a battle of witness testimonies. Now, the Crown's witnesses for the prosecution said that they told a very different story to the defence witnesses. Now, the lead Crown's witness was a man called Lieutenant Stanley Worth, who I mentioned earlier. Now, he was a Royal Navy officer who used to go along to seances for fun, so he said. He and his mates, they used to go out and go to seances as part of a lads' night out. They called it going to the spooks. So let's go to the spooks tonight, guys. It's an alternative to going down the pub or going down to the cinema or something. Hey, let's go to the spooks tonight. Yeah. Now he went to the spooks, and Helen Duncan happened to be the medium, and he was lured there. He said he was lured there with the promise of seeing something truly extraordinary and paranormal, and all he saw was Helen Duncan prancing around in a big white bedsheet over the top of her. And so he was very, very dismayed by this, and he saw it as his duty to bring her to justice. He was motivated by personal intentions alone and nothing else. And this is a story he maintained his entire life. He moved to New Zealand, actually, soon after the witchcraft trial, very oddly. It takes a determined journalist to get all the way there to see him. But he died quite recently, actually. He died, I think, in the early 2000s, and he stuck by his story till the very end. Now, there's a lot of suspicious things to do with Worth. A lot of suspicious things indeed. First of all, he lied under oath. Loseby said to him, Lieutenant Worth, are you in any way a member of the intelligence services? And he said, no, sir. That was a lie. Worth was a member of the Royal Navy Provost Special Investigation Division, so he's kind of a detective stroke spy. In fact, he was exactly the kind of person who wouldn't be going to the spooks for fun. He would be part of the operation to monitor Helen Duncan. He was the kind of guy who would be reporting to Maud and Fleming about the activities of Helen Duncan. I don't believe his story that he just was motivated by personal interest. He said, I'm spying on my own account, whatever the hell that means. I don't believe him. But he wasn't prosecuted he was never prosecuted for perjury. The trial just proceeded and nothing was done about it. Now, according to Worth, as I've already explained, he described the police raid in the trial. He and Rupert Cross stood up, blew on their whistles, switched on the lights, grabbed this bedsheet, this fake ectoplasm, and the police came in and arrested Helen and detained everyone. Now, this bedsheet, this sheet of cloth, was obviously a very important piece of evidence, wasn't it? It would be a major court exhibit, wouldn't it? So where was it? It couldn't be found. And Worth said, I'm sorry, we lost it. We couldn't find it. Let me say that again. A bedsheet or some kind of sheet big enough to cover a 20-stone woman. You've seen pictures of Helen Duncan. She was no ballerina. She's a big lady. a sheet big enough to cover her. So we're talking a king-size bed size sheet thing, king-size bed sheet kind of thing, that kind of size. In the chaos of a police raid, when the two attackers, the moles, have already got their hands on it, somehow got lost. They let go of it and it got lost. With the lights going on, the police bursting in, it got lost. Lowsby pressed him on this, and Worth just said, well, I'm afraid we couldn't find it. We lost it. Someone hid it. They must have hidden it. Lowsby said, how do you know someone hid it? Worth said, well, we couldn't find it, so they must have hidden it. This is a classic circular argument. Where was this bedsheet? We don't know. Someone must have hidden it. We lost it. How do you know someone hid it? Well, how else could we have failed to find it? Total and utter circular argument. Let's face it, there was no bedsheet. It was a lie. And there's something else. Now, if you watch the long version of this lecture, which is you can find, there'll be a link in the description box. I talk about Helen Duncan's relationship with a guy called Harry Price. Now, Harry Price was a psychic investigator who denounced her as a fraud in 1930. He came back into her life 14 years later into this courtroom. It must have been some kind of personal vendetta. He coached the prosecution witnesses, including Worth and all the others. Now, is that normal practice? Is that the way things are normally done? I mean, I'm not a lawyer. I mean, perhaps this is just the way the Crown Courts operate. I don't know. But to me, this is starting to look like an attempt to pervert the course of justice. Now, the defence testimony was very, very different. The defence witnesses told a very different story. They all said that they went to the Master Temple and they saw Helen Duncan exuding ectoplasm, which formed into real spirit. Mrs. Ann Potter was one of the most important of these witnesses. There were a lot of them. There were over 40 of these witnesses. Maybe too many. Maybe Lowsby overdid it a bit. That's Mrs. Ann Potter was sitting in the front row, and she said her mother appeared in front of her. She recognised her mother. Even the moles on her face, she said, that's my mother. And this spirit spoke to her and even kissed her. And the other defence witnesses said something similar. I mean, some people said they saw members of their family. Even a pet parrot called Bronco was seen, and a cat. Yeah, it was really quite remarkable. So there was this was essentially this battle of witness testimonies. There was no physical evidence because they somehow managed to lose this mystical levitating super bed sheet, or is that bed sheets all the way down? I don't know, but they somehow managed to lose this thing anyway. So it's just witness testimonies only. Now this is where the alleged crime took place. This is the Master Temple in Portsmouth, or the room above that shop is the Master Temple in Portsmouth. Now, it's today the room is just a room in a flat. It's a lounge in a flat, and the chemist shop is gone. Now, since this picture was taken, there's a jewellers there called the 301 Jewellers, and they operate there now. And so, but that is where it's behind that bay window was where the Master Temple used to be, and that's where it all took place. And I've actually managed to film in there, so I'm just going to now show you some film of the interior of the Master Temple. You're going to see the actual Master Temple as well as it is today, but I'm going to take you inside it. And here we are in the Master Temple. Well, it's not the Master Temple anymore. It's actually a lounge in the flat above the shop. And as you can see here, it's just a pretty ordinary lounge, very elegant, well decorated lounge. Just to get people to get their bearings, in this corner here where the TV is, that was where Helen had her cubicle. There was a black curtain across here, and Helen would be inside sitting on a chair. Now here there were rows of seats, and there was over 40 people in this room. You could get quite a lot in, so you can imagine there was a lot of people. But this room was slightly bigger because this here is a partition. And we'll come out here and I'll just show you. This stairway wasn't there. The stairway actually came up through there, and there was this passageway that led down to the chemist shop, to the homer's shop, and people used to come in here, they'd pay downstairs, come up here and take a seat. This light would be switched off, and there'd just be a 40-watt red bulb on a shelf over here, which is no longer there. And Albert often used to say, you know, can you dim that light by putting a handkerchief over it or something. So there'd be rows of seats here. You can imagine people packed in quite close together. I imagine the. You can understand how Mrs. Potter, as I'll be telling you about Mrs. Potter later, but she was in the front row, so she'd have had her knees almost up to the cubicle. This bay here, this would have been covered by a blackout blind. This window, because it was wartime. But this is the original step on the bench. Now this is covered over. The present owner of the house has covered that over, but that is the original footsteps. So some of the spectators would actually sit on here, and they'd actually sit on this bench with their feet there, and they'd watch Helen from this side, with this blackouted window behind. The current residents of this property have told me that there are strange goings on in this area. Now, I'm not the first person to come to this building because of Helen Duncan. Helen's granddaughter has been over here. Mediums have been here as well. The lady who lives here has told me that she's seen a cat. That is interesting because animals did sometimes materialise in these physical mediumship sessions. She's seen several other things like her footsteps and things like that, and some other strange things have happened here. So this, ladies and gentlemen, is the Master Temple. I'm very grateful to the lady who lives here for allowing me to come up here and have a look around. Much appreciated. So amazing to think, isn't it? It's changed a lot, but it's still the same. The fireplace is still there. Still the same room, and some of it is even still in the form it was in the 1940s. And that was the Master Temple there. And if you want to read more about the case against Helen Duncan and what happened to her, the Old Bailey has published the original court documents. You can buy it in a book here. Now, there were lots of other discrepancies that we might mention here. For example, there were some contradictions between the initial magistrate's testimony of Worth and Cross and what they said in the Old Bailey. Also, a very strange thing, a man in Oxford, a guy called Mr. Marshall, took out a bet in Oxford, where I live, and he took out a bet with a friend, and he said he predicted that Helen Duncan would be arrested and tried in the Old Bailey, and that the chief prosecuting witness would be a man called Stanley Worth. Now, he took this bet out before Helen was arrested, and he won the bet. How did he know? He must have known Worth, and Worth must have had wind of this beforehand. And what's more, who knows? Maybe Worth had a cut in the bet. There were other strange things that were said. For example, when Mrs. Ann Potter took the stand, Worth actually came up afterwards and said that she's lying. She can't possibly have recognised her mother because the lights in the room were too dim for people to recognise each other, because there's only this dim red light on a shelf in the corner. Sometimes Albert even demanded that someone put a handkerchief over the bulb to dim the lights even further. The thing about it is, Worth must be lying there, because the thing is, Worth himself was sitting. Ann Potter was in the front row, and recognised her. And according to Worth, it was too dark for her to recognise her mother. Yet at another time, Worth said he could recognise Helen Duncan. He was sitting in the second row, yet he could recognise Helen Duncan's face poking between the curtains in the cabinet. Contradiction. It's not one. Either one is true or the other is not. You can't be both. You can't have it both ways. So this is where Worth was lying. Now, what could have been done next? That's the question. Well, Charles Loseby was. I don't think Loseby did enough to. He didn't do enough to cross-examine these anomalies, these discrepancies in the testimony of the Crown witnesses. The reason was he was waiting for the next phase of the trial, because he had a plan. He had a trick up his sleeve. His trick was to get the entire case against Helen Duncan dismissed in one foul swoop. He would get Helen Duncan, amazingly, to perform a seance in the courtroom. If Mrs. Duncan is a materialization medium, then there is a spirit world near her at this moment, and a guide right here, possibly waiting for an opportunity to help her. Let us call him. Yes, here, in the Central Criminal Court of London. Why not? She requires a curtained-off partition and a red light. Nothing more. This is the acid test to which she should be willing to subject herself. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I tell you this much. She is so willing. That was how Charles Loseby propositioned the court to allow Helen Duncan to perform a seance in the courtroom. This was an incredible deviation from normal courtroom procedure. You could say that again. Guess what? The judge refused, point blank. Now, Loseby appealed. He appealed because because the wording of the Witchcraft Act of 1735 meant that if Helen could prove herself real, the Witchcraft Act wouldn't apply. I mean, this is a strange anomaly, because you can just imagine what the judge said. Spiritualism is not on trial here, Mr. Loseby. Mrs. Duncan is. Basically, it doesn't matter if she can spurt out ectoplasmic entities left, right, and centre 24/7. All right. The fact was, she didn't do it on the 19th of January, 1944, at the Master Temple in Portsmouth. That's all that matters. See, so it's all, on the legal level, it is understandable. It is understandable on one level, but let's face it. If Loseby had been, if Helen Duncan had been allowed to perform in court, it would have completely trashed the prosecution case against her. It would have completely, and she'd have had to be acquitted then, because then the prosecution would have to prove that a woman who was capable of real psychic mediumship would need to fake things, would have a technique for faking things. Helen was very keen to go along with Loseby's plan. She wanted to do this. She really wanted to do this. Now, the judge refused, as I said. Loseby appealed, and he agreed to poll the jury. He polled the jury, and the jury elected not to. I mean, what? WTF? If you were on that jury, would you vote no? Would you honestly, just for the sake of your own personal curiosity, would you really vote not to see something like that? Oh, blimey, unbelievable. There's other reasons behind this. I mean, I go into more detail in the longer version of this talk, but there are other reasons why this took place. So the trial went ahead without Helen being able to demonstrate in court. The verdict, well, on the 23rd of March, 1944, the jury went out to consider their verdict. The judge summed up. The jury went out. It took half an hour. The jury took half an hour to consider their verdict, and they came back guilty. Helen Duncan was sentenced to 9 months in Holloway Prison. As she was taken down, poor Helen, she cried out, "Oh my God! I haven't even done anything! Is there a God?" It's the only time she'd spoken during the trial, apart from at the beginning when she pled not guilty. Now, this connection between the supernatural and warfare is older and deeper than you might think. It goes back a long, long way. This here is Julius Caesar. Now, he used to consult a soothsayer before going into battle, who used to guide him. And Alexander the Great, a century or so earlier, he had a personal soothsayer who used to accompany him on his campaigns. He never went anywhere without him. And in 1429, the King of France took a young peasant girl from a village called Jeanne Roumet and put her in command of the French army. And Jeanne Roumet led the army to victory at the siege of Orleans. The king did this because he believed she was having divine inspiration from God, and it seemed to work. Jeanne Roumet led this army to victory at the siege of Orleans, beat the English. Unfortunately, the English captured Jeanne and burned her at the stake, but her legend has never been forgotten. We all know the story, don't we, of Joan of Arc. During the Cold War, both sides had a remote viewing project where they used people with psychic powers to spy on the other side. Now, Uri Geller might well have been involved in this. He claims he was, and there's evidence to suggest he was, with the CIA, Mossad, and the Stanford Research Institute. Now, I don't know, has any of you ever read a book called The Men Who Stare at Goats by John Ronson? It's an excellent book, very, very interesting indeed. The film is made from it. Don't bother with it; it's not as good. Well, it's funny, but it's not as informative as the book. But it's just all about how this is carried on. It's really, really amazing thing carried on. This is a newspaper clipping, which is actually from a few years ago. Jailed as a witch, branded as a spy. To go back to Helen Duncan, I'd like to present to you an alternative hypothesis. I'd like to put it to you, to use legal language, that Helen Duncan actually was a real psychic manifestation medium. A real one. Or at least, people in government thought she was. And they took her seriously. A large number of people in government thought she was, to the point where they were willing to take action. I believe that she was convicted in a kangaroo court through a conspiracy of agents within the judiciary, within the police, within the intelligence services, to concoct a false case against her to put her in jail. And the reason for this, well, what happened on the 6th of June 1944 while Helen was languishing in her jail cell in Holloway Prison. There was a mass amphibious landing of Allied troops on the beaches of Normandy, France. This was Operation Overlord, but history would come to know it as D-Day. This was a vast conspiracy. This was a vast secret. The secrets of D-Day was huge. It was enormous. There was basically, it was what I would call a very top-heavy conspiracy. Thousands of people were briefed in over the previous year or more. There was a massive. The government went to enormous lengths to keep the secrets of D-Day from the enemy, and also to confuse them and present disinformation. This is very interesting. They sowed active disinformation to try and convince the enemy that they were not going to land where they were. They actually created fake documents which they allowed the enemy to find. Fleming was involved with this incidentally. Ian Fleming was one of the guys who instigated this, which tried to persuade them they were going to invade via Italy from the south through the Mediterranean rather from the north through the English Channel and Normandy. It was a feint to lure the enemy away. Now, as I've said, there was problems with, because it would only take one person who had the knowledge of D-Day to die, and all the secrets would be over. All the secrecy would be wasted. Because if that person died, they could come through in Helen's seances. It would just take one enemy agent in the audience, and that's it. It's all over. They say dead men don't tell tales. Yes, they do. According to what people were thinking back then. What's more, in November of 1943, again, this is new information that's come to light. There was a terrible disaster. One of these landing craft, I mean, you've seen it in the movies, one of these big infantry landing ships with these landing boats with a ramp at the front. One of those was exercising off the coast of Dorset, fully laden with troops. And it sunk, and everyone on board was killed. So that was all those people in the spirit world with the secrets of D-Day floating round, waiting for a time to come forward in Helen Duncan's seances and spill the beans to the enemy. The government couldn't risk that. They had to stop Helen practicing just in case. The irony is, and I mean, there's the question is, why not? This is the sad thing. I mean, because on one level, I'm glad they convicted her, because if they hadn't, they'd probably have killed her. So maybe her conviction saved her life. But then the question is, why not just pay her off? Why not just pay her off? I mean, this is the thing. They could have there was no need for this. They could have taken her to one side, get her to sign the Official Secrets Act, and say, Helen, look, we just don't want you to practice for the next few months. No mediumships, just for a few months. Here's a few £100 a month to compensate you for loss of earnings. Okay, we can't tell you why, but just please don't do any mediumship. And that's all that was necessary. I mean, the money they'd give her would probably be more than what she was earning. And it would cost less than the trial. Maybe there's another reason why they actually put her on trial, and I'll talk about that in the longer version of this talk. Now, one thing the skeptics will tell you is that the reason this was done was there was a kind of climate of woo hanging over the British government in those days, because it was a well-known fact that Winston Churchill was a believer. He was a believer in spiritualism. And so that's basically because of his influence. Everyone else believed in it too, and therefore Churchill and that made sure that they all believed in They all believe Helen Duncan was real. But that's probably not true, because it turns out that Winston Churchill didn't even know about it. We know that because he found out about it when he read in the newspapers. Like everyone else, he read it in the newspapers. And we know he didn't know about it because there's a memo in existence which he wrote to the Home Secretary during the witchcraft trial, which said this: "Let me have a report on why the Witchcraft Act of 1735 was used in a modern court of justice. What was the cost of this trial to the state, observing that witnesses were brought from Portsmouth and maintained here in this crowded London for a fortnight, and the recorder kept busy with all this obsolete tomfoolery, to the detriment of necessary work in the courts." He knew nothing about it. So what? This is the thing. So, what's the answer? That's the question. This is a photograph of Helen Duncan after the witchcraft trial, looking world weary, tired, wiser, older and wiser, but also very, very sad. She was hurt badly by the witchcraft trial, and the 9 months she spent in prison had an enormous effect on her. She was bitter about the fact that she was not allowed to perform a seance in court. That very much upset her. Helen Duncan was released from prison in September 1944. She returned to mediumship. The Witchcraft Act was repealed soon after that. She was, contrary to popular belief, she was not the last person prosecuted under the Witchcraft Act, but she was the last person jailed. She was the second last person to be prosecuted. It was replaced by the Fraudulent Mediums Act of 1941, which was a bit of a fallback position for the government. There was a lot of campaigning as a result of the Witchcraft Act after what happened to Helen. But the Fraudulent Mediums Act was a kind of it was a bit of a compromise. It was better than the Witchcraft Act. This in itself was repealed in 2008, and there's been no replacement since. The anti-spiritualists lobby, the people who actually do, again, your opinion of this will depend not only on your belief in spiritualism or disbelief in it, but your view on people's civil rights and whether people have a right to have access to spiritualism if they want it, or whether they should be dictated to by the state and told that they can't. It's one for the moral maze, I think. They've been using existing consumer protection legislation to try and prevent psychic mediums, in their eyes, defrauding people. On Sunday the 28th of October 1956, Helen Duncan performed her last seance. This was at the West Bridgeford Spiritualist Church in Nottingham. This was like the Master Temple, it was a room in someone's house that had been converted for use of spiritualism. It was very much like the police raid in 1944. There was just there was a police raid on the property, and the police burst in. Helen Duncan was badly hurt, psychologically and physically. It was an awful situation because the police basically dragged her out, and she was hurt. She was badly hurt. They called a doctor, but the doctor wasn't called to help her. They said to the doctor, basically, we want you to search her, so the way that the nurse used to search her. So basically, what they wanted the doctor to do was to strip Helen naked in front of these big burly policemen and poke and prod her in every corner she had. And the doctor refused, of course. And that's when he also, not only, he said that she was so traumatised, she was traumatised as it is, and this would traumatise her even further, but not only that. She had second-degree burns on her chest, her stomach, and her legs. And this was caused, say the spiritualists, it was kind of like an electrical burn, and the spiritualists say that this was caused by the ectoplasm being disturbed during the seance, that the light switched on, the police rushed in, things like that. It actually causes these burns. Now, I found out where this spiritualist church was. It's not there anymore. It's a family home. The family who ran it in those days are still there. The next generation is still living there. And there was no question of me filming like I did at the Master Temple. In fact, they were very hostile, these people. They told me to go away. They even objected to me filming in the street outside, although I told them, I'm entitled to film here. It's a public highway. But it's pretty obvious. There was a lot of there's still a lot of a lot of regret and a lot of fear regarding this situation. Even after all these years, it still has an effect what happened to Helen that day. I went to the West Bridge Spiritualist Church's new location, which is, it has its own purpose-built room now, its own purpose-built premises. And they have a little Helen Duncan museum there too, which is basically just a little corner with some newspaper clippings like the one I showed you earlier. And they didn't know where it was. I had to do a bit of detective work to actually find out where this house was, and I went there, and all I did was film outside, and then they got very uppity about it. Now, Helen was treated for her burns and returned to Edinburgh to recuperate, her home where she was living at the time. But she never really got over it, and on the 6th of December she died at the age of 59. Now, her death certificate does not say anything about the event on the 28th of October. It doesn't say anything about that being the cause of the death, but I mean, she was not a well woman. She suffered from all kinds of health problems all her life. She was overweight by a big stretch. She had diabetes. She had many other problems like that. There's no way she was going to live to a ripe old age. But when you look at what happened, I mean, what her family say, it's pretty obvious that police raid killed her. She could have gone on living for a little longer without that police raid. But according to her supporters, Helen is still in contact. She's been back, and she continues to be backed. And there was a campaign to pardon Helen Duncan that basically began in one form or another. It's been running since her conviction. And this is their website, helenduncan.org. There's been a long, bitter struggle by many, many people, including Helen's granddaughter, Maggie Hahn, who I had on her Panmo radio. I've got to know her. They've been trying to get the government to pardon Helen for what happened, because it was such a sham. What happened to her? It was a kangaroo court, like I said. They framed her and locked her up when she'd done nothing wrong. They've not had a lot of luck up till now, unfortunately. The pardon has always been refused, but since in the last couple of years, something has happened which has given the campaign a new impetus, a new hope. Now, do you recognise this man? This is Alan Turing. Now, this man is actually one of the most important people in the history of World War II regarding Britain's war effort. He was a genius in electronics. He was a prodigy. He was a pioneer in the design of computers, and he's one of the first people in the world to come up with the concept of artificial intelligence and to actually lay out plans for artificially intelligent machines. This guy built a computer which actually decoded the supposedly unbreakable code that the Germans had called Enigma. This was a very, very complicated code that was supposedly unbreakable, yet Turing built a computer that decrypted it. It was an incredible achievement, and the Germans actually couldn't believe that this had been done. But this gave the Allies a massive advantage in the war. This man should have been one of the greatest war heroes of all, yet it was not to be. The story of Alan Turing is tragic and shameful. Alan Turing, rather than being thanked by his nation and lauded as a hero, he was arrested and convicted. He was convicted under for gross indecency under the sodomy laws. Now, what this means is basically he was caught in 1952. He was caught doing something which today is considered perfectly acceptable and even trendy. He was an out-of-the-closet homosexual. He was locked up in jail, but then they made him a deal. He could be released from jail on condition that he underwent medical treatment to turn him straight, supposedly. This treatment consisted of drugs which ruined his physical and mental health, and in 1954 he committed suicide. There's been a campaign to pardon Alan Turing, running for many, many years now. And now, the reason they want to pardon him is because, and they have actually succeeded, I should say they have succeeded. In 2008, Gordon Brown, the Prime Minister, issued an apology to Alan Turing. That was not the same thing as a pardon, so the struggle went on. But in 2013, he was actually pardoned. He was pardoned, and this sets up a major common law precedent. Because what's good for Alan Turing is good for Helen Duncan. The basis of his case, and there's actually legislation going through Parliament right now, which is going to be called Turing's laws. And the basis for this is that if you're convicted of a crime and later on the statute under which you're prosecuted is repealed, you can receive an official pardon for it. Now, in the case of Alan Turing, the laws under which he was convicted, the sodomy laws, they were all repealed in 1967. So if he'd been caught after that, basically there's no offence. He's not done anything wrong. Which is why they pardoned him. Now, it's in the legal terms, it's exactly the same situation with Helen Duncan, because she was convicted under the Witchcraft Act of 1735, which was repealed in 1951. She can receive a pardon too. And once this legislation's gone through court, and the government still don't pardon her, Maggie and the others, they can sue the government. So I think justice is coming for Helen Duncan, and her supporters who say that Helen Duncan is in the spirit world will be very, very pleased by that, and I'm sure Helen will be too. So, well, this is, as I say, this is new information. It's not in the previous talk, even in the long version of this talk. So there may be, next time I do this, there may be even more. So hopefully I'll be able to report soon that Helen Duncan has been pardoned. The fight will not stop until that's happened. And if you want to know anything more about Helen Duncan or any other subjects that I discuss, you can find it all on my website, hpanwo.blogspot.co.uk, Hospital Porters Against the New World Order. And I talk about all kinds of things. It's a multimedia stuff there. There's radio shows, TV, the YouTube channel. There's a forum. There's my fictional work. Oh, and I write books as well. I've got a new book out called Roswell Rising, which you can pick up at all good bookshops for £9. So check that out. In the meantime, thank you. I want to thank you all for inviting me. Thanks to Alison Dunlop for recommending me, and for Norrie and everyone else who's organised this event. And thank you all for listening.